everyone, I'm Terralon. Welcome to Time Out with Tinseltown Mom. I'm here today with top legal expert and licensed education attorney, Catherine Michael. Catherine represents students and their families in a variety of education and personal injury matters, including special education due process, disciplinary issues, personal injury of children, sexual abuse, school shooting victims, as well as other civil rights and disability claims experienced by students. Today, we're going to talk about best ways parents can advocate for their child if they feel like they're being bullied at school. Hi, Catherine. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you so much for being here today. Why don't we just get started by you telling us a little bit more about you and specifically what you do?
So I am an education attorney, and what that means is I represent students in all sorts of school issues. Those can range from Title IX issues to what's called educational due process for children who have special needs. I represent parents and children in situations involving bullying. And it's interesting, I got into this because I was actually working in the healthcare field and I was working with a hospital, and we kept having situations where we couldn't get services for kids who had special needs and were being placed in the hospital. And what most parents don't know is that public schools actually have that responsibility. So we started taking some of those cases and helping those families. And for me, it just had a snowball effect. I started getting more calls than I could take in that capacity. And eventually, and this would be back about 2001, 2002, opened my own practice doing that. Our firm is Connell Michael Kerr, and we have offices in Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Texas, and really my focus has stayed the same. I really want to help families, and I really enjoy working with kids. And I do have two of my own who are, we all are biased as far as our children, but I have two girls, and they are both adults now. So the hard part is done, and now I'm really just getting a chance to truly enjoy them.
Oh, wonderful. So I'm wondering if you've ever had experience with bullying with your kids since, I'm sure no one wants to cross you.
Yeah, but I think we all, for every child now, if you're not bullied at some point, it's going to be really unusual. Both of my girls experienced a little bit of it, and I think it was mostly on social media, and it's been one of those things that I tried to give them a good perspective. And I think it was dealing day to day with it in my practice that really helped me put them in a position where they could navigate it, and perhaps a little bit easier than I think some kids. But it is something that I see in almost any parent I'm talking to. And like everybody else, I'm out at lunch with my friends at times and hearing about what's going on with their children. And bullying is something that once upon a time, it happened to 1 out of every 5 kids. Now I think any child we talk to will have either experienced bullying or know other children who are experiencing it, or other teenagers who are experiencing it. And the interesting thing about bullying is we have no tolerance for it out in the workplace, right? If in my office I had 2 employees bullying each other, it's an absolutely, no tolerance policy. In schools, it's so commonplace that's what becomes scary is the long-term effects we see for children who are being chronically bullied.
Yeah, and we're definitely going to get into that today. I definitely want to talk about the different levels of bullying for sure. So today we're talking about how parents can advocate for their child if they suspect they may be getting bullied at school. But first, Catherine, can you clarify what bullying is versus maybe what it's not? I mean, I don't know if mean behavior is considered bullying. It may be, but can you just kind of clarify what it is just so we're all on the same page?
That's an absolutely excellent question. When I use the term bullying, I'm almost thinking about it in a legal context. And bullying would be where we have a continuous action from one person to another with the intent to harass, intimidate, or cause psychological or emotional distress. So bullying would not be something that is a one-off. In other words, and what we're going to see on a routine basis. And I think a lot of us refer to bullying as, your child's walking down the hall and somebody, makes fun of their shirt and goes on. Okay, that is normal behavior between students. It's not great, but teenagers are going to do that. Kids are going to do that. Someone who wears glasses may get called four eyes. Again, that's things that make our children uncomfortable, but it's not going to rise to the level of what we're really considering under the law as bullying. Bullying would be something where we were, again, seeing that happen, not on one or two occasions, but on a repeated basis.
And by the same person, I'm assuming, right?
Yeah, or group of people. For instance, let's say a student is being harassed by the football team or bullied by the football team. It doesn't necessarily have to be one person. It could be where it's a group of people who are in a similar group.
Okay. Now, what if a parent suspects that their child is being bullied? What should be their first course of action?
And it depends on where the bullying is happening. So if you suspect your child is being bullied, and we believe this is happening in a school, you definitely want to create a paper trail and get school personnel involved in basically nipping it in the bud. And the earlier you can fix it, the better. And the reason you want to notify the school is it's more than twofold. I was about to say twofold, but it's multi-pronged, we should say. Number one, you want it to stop, and you want it to stop promptly. And if it's happening at school, as parents, we can't walk into our kids' school buildings and stop the bullying for them. So we're going to need the school personnel to do that. Secondly, we want them to be aware of it and to be actively engaged in providing emotional support to your child, whether that's through the school counselor, through the guidance office, through the principal actually doing an investigation. 3, if your school has a bullying problem and you are reporting bullying to them, they actually, in many states, have to keep charts of who has reported bullying so that you can actually be on the lookout for schools that have these problems. In the departments of education for each individual state can send schools who are having bullying problems more resources. So that's another reason to do it. And lastly, there are many parents who are in school districts that seem to not be responsive, and that's a really unfortunate situation. But in those districts where we have the argument that that school is showing deliberate indifference, they have knowledge of the bullying, and they're purposely just ignoring you, that's where you may later have a case against the school for failing to intervene and stop it.
Now, before it gets to the school level, like, is there ever a scenario where maybe the parent can coach the child to advocate for themselves? Let's say it's happened a few times, and before it actually gets to the school, the parent coaches the child on what to do, and maybe it's possible it could actually stop? Or are you saying that the school should get involved right away?
And I think it depends. And I'll give you a couple of examples. If we have 2 teenage girls who were previously friends, they've had a spat, and we're talking a few weeks where they're making remarks to each other, and that type of thing where your child is feeling bullied. That is a sort of what I would consider an initially a little bit of a benign situation. In other words, it's not going to be one that is going to cause your child necessarily long-term severe psychological distress. So let's say, both of the parents know each other, this other child. It may be something where you can sit down with your child and say, look, sometimes when people have disagreements, and especially, during the teenage years, there's going to be some discomfort in your interactions. And here are the ways that we work to make up with people, or to basically declare a truce. I'm sorry for what I said about you. I want us to be able to, even if we're not friends any longer, move forward together. And I mean, there are many, many opportunities I think we all have to have teachable moments. Now, I'm going to distinguish those types of things, which happen to all of our kids, all the time, whether they're in elementary school, middle school, or high school, from what I would consider significant bullying. And that's where it's a harassment that is sexual in nature, that where the purpose is to intimidate your child or make their life so difficult they don't want to attend school, or it's already having such a detrimental effect on your child that you're considering therapy or leaving the school system. That's where you really want to nip it in the bud. The other thing that I really encourage parents to avoid is something called learned helplessness. I have had parents who come to me who have had children bullied for years. And what they've done is, when the child comes home and cries, they give them the pep talk. They talk about bullying when they were kids, and they send their child right back into school. And the child is being put day after day after day into an environment that really is intolerable. And that's where we start to see chronic depression, anxiety, and the parent, doesn't want to necessarily rock the boat. They don't understand the extent of it. And the idea is, this is something that happens to everybody, and it shouldn't. And it really is at some point when it becomes that intentional long-term harassment, it is against the law, and the school has an absolute legal obligation to step in and stop it.
Now, before we talk about the school's responsibility, can you just give examples of the types of bullying that there are out there?
Yeah, for sure. So you can have bullying that is basically just harassment, okay? And in many states, there aren't bullying laws. And so when I say harassment, this is basically where somebody is using, whether it's physical or verbal, making, threatening actions, insulting your appearance, making statements on a daily basis that are detrimental to your well-being, or every other day, right? Where we're really looking at behavior that is intentional actions to try and influence you in a negative manner. Every state actually has sort of a different definition of bullying itself. And I do distinguish that a little bit between that and what I would call sexual intimidation, which would fall under Title IX. And that's where someone is making fun of you because of your sexual orientation, making comments related to the way you look, whether it's, for a female, breast, rear end, and this can be certainly girls making comments to other girls, boys making comments to other boys. So that type of what we would call like sexual intimidation, bullying in that manner is really going to fall under what's called Title IX. And Title IX prohibits schools from allowing anything that would be considered like sexual intimidation or creating a sexually hostile environment.
And then there's also cyberbullying. Is there anything specific with that parents need to know about?
Yeah, cyberbullying is the same sort of thing. If your child is getting daily, weekly, mean, intimidating notes with the purpose of basically hurting, threatening, frightening your child, then we're going to have a problem. And the school still could be looped into that. Just so parents know, and we're talking about public schools there, if they become aware of it. And cyberbullying has become an increasing issue, and I'm sure you've seen this as well, over the past 10 years. I didn't really, back in the early 2000s, it was one of those things where you heard about it on occasion, but now I would say we get a substantial amount of those cases every year.
I'm hearing more and more of those cases. So once it's established that the parents should go to the school with this behavior from another student, ideally, how should the school handle it?
So in an ideal situation, they would first do an investigation. If your child had any proof that they had been physically harmed, any of their property had been damaged, that they were, the notes, including on cyberbullying, that it was causing a difficult environment in the school. I mean, any proof that your child had, the school would ferret all that out. And from there, what they would do is meet with both students or meet with the group of students and basically say, we're going to begin taking disciplinary action if it doesn't stop right now, or we're going to take disciplinary action because what we're seeing has been so severe, persistent, that it has absolutely created an intimidating and hostile environment for the student who's been bullied. And now we're just going to go ahead and take action at this point.
Right. Now, what if they do the meeting with the students and of course, kids lie. Let's say the bullies lie. Oh, I didn't do that. And it's their word against the other word. Like how would they handle that situation?
Yeah, and that's where parents want to keep copies of things. Normally, let's say you have a situation where it's just some kid who's been coming down the hall. Every time he's coming down the hall, he's getting pushed into a locker or someone's saying something insulting. I mean, that's where schools actually now, most of them have cameras in their hall. They need to be reviewing that. If it's something where they cannot find proof, that would be where you would simply ask them to separate the two students. And if there was a situation where they could put them so they had different passing periods, different lunch periods, that would be the action that you would expect. Now, as you can imagine, if you have a victim and a perpetrator who's saying, I didn't do any of this, the problem that schools often run into is their refusal to change class schedules. And so then it's up to the parents of the victim. And I usually say it's far better for your child to just go ahead and change classes than to get in a fight over who is going to make the move from Algebra 1 with Miss Peterson to Algebra 1 with Mr. Peterson. And so that's where it becomes essential, because again, what you really want to avoid with your child is a feeling that there is nothing they can do, because
Right.
that's really where we begin to see anxiety and depression set in for kids. And unfortunately, the suicide cases that we've handled, it's when that child again believes that there is no way out of that situation, and this is how their life will just proceed from here on out. And that's why, I bring up that term early on, learned helplessness, because parents, and we all do this, but we often, again, fall into this assumption that bullying is something that is a part of life to some extent, or that it's not as bad as we think it is. And if you have a child that is coming to you and saying, I'm being bullied, at some point, regardless of the battle you might be having with the school, you do need to find ways, and certainly it's not your child's fault, but you're going to have to find ways to get your child out of that situation, even though you're saying, shouldn't the school be taking action? Shouldn't this other family be taking action? Shouldn't, for instance, in cases where they made police reports, shouldn't the police or the prosecutor's office be taking actions? Certainly, absolutely they should, but it's up to you as a parent to make sure that this is a situation to where if you have a child who you believe is in deep emotional distress, to get them out of that situation.
Right. Now, I hear so many scenarios where parents say that they feel like the school's not doing much to help. Do you hear that as well?
Oh my goodness, constantly. Depending on where your child is going to school, we have educators who are burnt out. We have educators who maybe, 20, 30 years when they went into this, they were really interested in kids, but now they're feeling a little overwhelmed. We have educators who have a lot going on in their own personal lives. I had a case where the counselor was getting all these reports again and again about a child, and really was failing to take action. That child ended up making a suicide attempt, and it was one of the things in that case that we brought up is they were completely aware. What we later found out is that the counselor was caring for a parent with dementia at home. Her spouse had left her. She had a child with autism. She couldn't get into a group home. So she was really overwhelmed. Thus, she wasn't taking any of the steps she should have when she was made aware of a really severe and persistent case of chronic bullying. And the parent really in that case thought, well, going to the school counselor was enough. They didn't go then to the principal. They just kept emailing the counselor, who said, don't worry, I've relayed this information. And in truth, she hadn't. But that's, it's become very, very commonplace for schools to ignore it. Sometimes in quite shocking ways, where I'm really surprised when I see the failure to take any steps to remedy it.
Yeah. So at what point, let's say the school is failing to do their part, at what point should a parent maybe remove their child from the school until they get some sort of help?
Yeah, I think if you believe that your child, if you have what I would say a reasonable fear of any physical harm to your child, or a reasonable fear that your child is going to be psychologically harmed, that it is better if you have the ability to get them out of that situation sooner rather than later, and then to deal with it. And, and again, this is in respect to what I'm calling, severe, persistent bullying that is intimidating to your child. What you don't want to do is necessarily wait it out if you're really becoming concerned for your child. It's better at that point to either place your child privately for a little while. In some states, they have forms where you can basically keep your child at home for a time period until you get the situation remedied. For instance, in Indiana, they call it a certificate of incapacity. If your child if their psychological state is such that it's not good for them to be in school at this time. In other states, there are all sorts of forms. And basically, if your child is having anxiety and depression, and you are having a reasonable thought that this situation is getting out of hand, again, just based on what I've seen, it is better to act sooner rather than later. And think about, like, all of us again in a work environment. If every time I walked down the hall at work, someone was pushing me into the wall, using bad language to insult me, tripping me, and I was being forced to go back into that environment day after day. When I got home, I was receiving texts from my work colleagues that were hateful. None of us as adults would accept that, right? You and I would
Right.
do our job the next day, and we basically file an action against that employer if they weren't allowing it. So the difference is, because in the U.S. we have compulsory attendance laws, that we would never allow this as adults. I have no clue why we would say it's fine to basically subject a child to that and let it go on month after month.
I mean, that's so powerful that you even made that distinction there. Like, in your workplace as an adult, we wouldn't want to experience that. So why do we let a child go through that and not correct the situation? Like, I'm so glad you brought that up.
And, one thing for parents to remember too is that the same laws that apply to us as adults, whether, I'm going to give you an example, like assault and battery, those still apply to kids. So if your child gets, we often hear of fights, in a school parking lot, your child gets like slammed into somebody else's car, somebody hits them, it's still battery. There shouldn't be a distinction because it happened in a school parking lot compared to if it happened, in a grocery store parking lot. And assault, which is basically where you are threatening someone, you're telling them, you show up here and I'm going to beat the heck out of you, then that also is an intimidation, which is a criminally reportable offense. And that's why, I hear from a lot of parents who are often upset that some states have not passed bullying laws. About 30 have, I believe, at this point. But most of these states are saying, we already have laws that govern harassment, intimidation, assault, battery. And certainly we have Title IX, which is a federal law, and all of those can still be used. Bullying is just sort of adding to those laws, but we already have laws on the books that can be enforced.
Interesting. So having said that, when should a parent get law enforcement involved if they feel like they need to?
Yeah, again, I think it becomes one of those situations where if you think your child is, and I use the reasonable person standard because that's what the law uses for a lot. So if you reasonably believe that your child is going to be physically injured, absolutely you need to get the police involved. If you reasonably believe that your child has been assaulted, battered, or is being intimidated on a daily basis, I would go ahead and make a police report anyway. And I want to distinguish this from what we would say are typical teenage spats, typical teenage angst, two girlfriends or two, guys who are on the football team, say some mean things to each other for a week or so. That is not what these laws are necessarily designed to be preventing. But if you have a situation where it's much more than that, I mean, that's where I think it's really important for parents to take action and take action early.
Yeah, no, that's good. So let's say the school's involved now and they do recognize that the child is being bullied. So there's evidence, there's proof, etc. How should the school handle that bully? Like, what should be their consequence, I guess, for whatever the behavior was,
Yeah,
ideally?
yeah, and I think it can depend. And it can depend on the extent of it. Some bullying that has been really, really severe. So if we're talking about a perpetrator and they have severely bullied another student, that's where we look at alternative placements for that student. A lot of school districts actually have alternative schools. They have therapeutic day placements that they can place a student in, because what we have to always remember is a perpetrator of bullying, it doesn't happen on its own, usually in a vacuum. So if a child is severely bullying other children to the point that we are concerned about other children's well-being, that child could have emotional disabilities, a mood disorder, maybe being abused at home. And so as a school, you have to go into that with the open mind of, our job is not just to necessarily help the victim. Our job is to figure out, how do we help the perpetrator as well? Schools can offer counseling. They can offer social work services. If that child has an emotional disability, I mean, they can place that child, certainly with their parents' consent, in a therapeutic day placement. They can require counseling. And I really like when schools actually put together a plan to say, how do we actually teach this young person to not bully, right? Why is this happening? And how do we help them? Because really, I mean, that's the goal of education for all of us, right? It's to make sure that we are teaching these individuals to become as independent, as functional, and still, retaining what makes us all human. And that's, compassion, empathy. And so if we have a child who's engaged in really aggressive negative behaviors, it bodes well for a school. And there's actually funding for them in place to do this, to do a full psychoeducational evaluation on that child, to get them the necessary counseling. If they are, causing enough harm within that school building, to then look at alternative placements where they can get the skills that they need to return. Because we all know, if somebody's bullying like this in high school and they get out, the regular world isn't going to tolerate it. And so we need to give them the skills now to make themselves better.
That's good. That's good. So let's say it doesn't get to the level of placing them elsewhere, but maybe suspension or detention. I don't know. Does the school have an obligation to let the parents know what the consequence is going to be for that bully?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So that bullying, what would typically happen is a parent would receive a letter saying your child has been accused of such and such. In most states, if you're going to suspend a child for longer than 10 days, you actually have to have an expulsion hearing, and it will vary state to state. But if you're going to do, let's say, a 2-week suspension, then you would have to do that. I am typically not in favor of suspensions in general, because sending a child home to play on their Xbox or watch television for 2 weeks typically isn't going to solve a bullying problem. It's not going to really get that child the help they need. So what when I'm working with a private school client or a charter school client, what I'll often advise is that they basically, determine, again, do we need to do an evaluation of this child? So that's the first thing I suggest for schools, is contact the parent and say, look, we conducted this full investigation. Your child is really bullying others. We want you to come in and we want to talk about this. I then, think that they need to remove that child immediately from any classes where they were coming into contact with the victim. And you need to really keep a close eye on them. In those situations, typically you want to keep a close eye because you want to make sure there's no type of retaliatory action. Then the next thing is after that evaluation is completed, that's where the school needs to be putting in place that daily or weekly counseling, or making counseling a requirement for that. They can do these agreements. They call them different things in different states, but basically it's an agreement. We're not going to expel you provided you take the following actions. Weekly counseling of at least an hour, research into understanding the consequences of bullying, a letter of apology to the victim, and sometimes even, depending on the situation, it's requiring that they participate in some type of even, group counseling to try and understand more about the effects of bullying. That would be, in a perfect world, what we often see in these cases, and 90% of them, is that schools, if it's a bad enough situation, they simply expel the bully, usually for 6 months to a year.
And I see suspension a lot too. Just, at my kids' school, I feel like behavior, that's usually the punishment. A day suspension, 2 days,
yeah,
things like that.
Right. And it doesn't work, right? I mean, yeah, the parent is irritated with them. Maybe they're going to try and cover their tracks. But really, again, when we're talking about severe, persistent, pervasive actions that create a really intimidating, hostile environment for the individuals around them, right, that child has something going on that 1 day or 2 weeks out of school isn't going to solve. And that's where I really, my call up to action to schools is, your job is, again, not only to help the victim, which you absolutely have to be doing, but to really help the perpetrator. The other thing that can happen, and this is one of my pet peeves, is that some of the bullies are kids who have truly emotional disabilities, intellectual disabilities, processing speed issues. Sometimes these are kids who are failing in school because they have undiagnosed specific learning disabilities. So they try and get attention, they try and get out of classes by just becoming a behavioral disruption. And so when those kids then are getting suspended or expelled, and they're already really behind their peers, and the bullying has been truly a cry for help, that's a really frustrating thing. And that's truly why I am not a believer in suspensions or expulsions, unless we had a situation, for instance, involving guns or explosives or something where we really need to separate that child from the school environment and figure some things out.
Yeah, no, that's so powerful, and that's so good what you're saying. Just going back to the bully and the consequence that they have, does the school have an obligation to let the victim know what the consequence of that bully will be?
No. So, and they can tell them, but FERPA protects schools a little bit from having to disclose that information. That said, FERPA doesn't prevent schools from disclosing what you would be able to figure out anyway. Okay. And that's why, for instance, you can post grades on the outside of a class, you can pass back assignments. There are all sorts of exceptions to that rule. And it's actually, it's pretty unenforceable, all things considered, but they can say, look, Jimmy, Terrence or Olivia or whoever the bully has been isn't going to be coming back for a couple of weeks. We're going to be working with them, and I want you to know that this situation will end. Okay, they can certainly say that. They can, but going into detail, like we've said that Olivia now has to get a psychoeducational evaluation, and we're requiring her to have weekly counseling because we think she may have emotional disabilities. They probably should not be doing that. That definitely subjects them a little bit to disclosing the information about another student.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And then just winding down this conversation, the $1 million question, when should a parent get a lawyer involved?
Well, and it depends on where you are. If you're in a state that has a lot of education attorneys, and some states have a ton, others don't have very many at all, and you're in a situation where, again, it's gotten so severe that you're actually thinking, oh my gosh, do I need to get an attorney? It can be helpful. It can be helpful just from just having somebody to sit down with, understanding your school's obligations, understanding that if this is continuing to go on, how to create that paper trail, And even having somebody to go with you if you wanted to meet with the school so that you feel like you've got an ally there who's guiding you. In states where there are, a few of us, we all know the school's attorneys. Sometimes, phone calls can be made and we can work to nip it in the bud very, very quickly for a family. That said, it really does come to a case-by-case basis. And that's where I say if a parent gets to the point where they're so desperate, because we all know, right? Most of us don't like to talk to attorneys unless we absolutely have to. But if a parent has gotten to the point to where they're actually thinking about it, it's not a bad idea just to put out feelers. And that's not because you want to bring an action against your school. It's because every state is going to have slightly different requirements on what may be sexual harassment within a school, what may be violations of Title IX, again, talking about those sexual elements, what may be intimidation versus if your state has bullying laws. And I think, getting advised of that, spending an hour with someone can be really helpful for a parent who's really just trying to make a decision.
Right. Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. Is there anything else you think that as parents we need to know just regarding this topic, just that might be helpful?
Yeah, I think it's first that we're all going to encounter this with our kids. Again, it's either whether it's our child who gets bullied or, our child who for some reason becomes a perpetrator or their friends. And I think it really is helping guide our kids as to what is appropriate, what is kind. It's really helping them focus on their role within society, right? We are all to be helpers of others. We're going to have to get along with people throughout our lives. And it's really teaching that early and often. And I think also one thing that I don't see as many parents do now, and I think it is important, is truly creating a life for your child outside of the school environment. And whether it's you get them into horseback riding, gymnastics, different outside clubs, that helps create a more even social experience. And it gives your child resources outside of school, because whether or not your child is an A student or a C- student, the world is much more well-rounded than I think school leads some people to believe. And it's really important that you focus on that with your child too, so that they develop a social circle and realize that school is not the end all be all, right? It's just basically an educational institution so we can learn to write, read, do basic math. But that if things aren't going well there, again, either academically or socially, that there's a whole world out there beyond that. And that is, I think, the most important message I can give parents is the kids I see who have discovered lives outside of school seem to fare better all the way around. And I think that it really does become an essential part of raising a child who understands the broadness of the world.
That's excellent. Well, thank you again, Catherine, for being here today. Where can people find you if they want to know about you and what you do?
Yeah, they can actually just go to our law firm website and we have information on everyone. And I do many, many things outside of practicing law, as I'm sure you know. We host a weekly meeting for parents on Saturdays where we talk about parenting, we talk about educational advocacy, how to interact with your school, and you can certainly email me and we can set you up with that. I also do a lot of speaking to parent groups, and you can just go to the website. It's www.C as in Connell, M as in Michael, K as in Kerr, lawfirm.com.
Thanks for listening to Time Out with Tinseltown Mom. If you liked what you heard today, please be so kind and rate, review, and subscribe on iTunes, because when you do that, you get this podcast in front of more listeners. And I want to offer more encouragement to a wider audience. So any positive reviews that you can give would be so helpful. Until next time.